Hello, ISHR students. Welcome to my second attempt at a video lecture. Today's topic is economic growth. It's one of the four major macroeconomic policy goals. And basically, we're going to be going over everything you need to know based on the IB curriculum. And we'll go ahead and go over that. This is a video lecture. It's an attempt at flipped learning. So watch this video or read your textbook, and when you come to class, we're going to practice and expand upon your existing knowledge that you got from this video lecture. Anyway, economic growth is a macroeconomic policy goal. It's something that all countries seek to do. All countries want economic growth. They want to increase their GDP over time. They want to do this with the hope of, with the hope of expanding GDP would also mean, hopefully, expanded GDP per capita. That means that people, on average, per person, the per person income in a given country is higher, and as people earn more income, they have, usually, but not always, a higher quality of living, a higher standard of living from increased income. So we want economic growth for multiple reasons, but one of the main ones would definitely be increased per capita income per person and increases in increases or improvements in the living standards of the citizens. Okay, economic growth. How is it defined? Well, the first definition is just simply it's an increase in real GDP over time. It's an increase in real GDP over time. Please remember that. That's an important definition. You could also say it's an increase in real output or in the output of goods and services over time. That's also acceptable. And please note that, you calculate GDP by comparing it from one year to another. For example, Germany's GDP right now is around, this is just an approximate figure, but let's say it's around 3.7 trillion. And last year, the GDP was 3.5 trillion. That would mean that GDP has expanded by 0.2 trillion or $200 billion, usually calculated in dollars. So anyway, because GDP has expanded in that year period, if it's gone up by that much in 1 year and our population has not really increased, we should have an increase in GDP per capita and hopefully an improvement in living standards. HL students, you need to know how to calculate GDP growth. It's, again, the formula right here, GDP new minus GDP old over GDP old times 100. Based on the number that I just gave you, 3.7 trillion in 2014 and 3.5 trillion in 2013, could you calculate Germany's GDP growth? Go ahead and take a moment and do that. And use your calculator or use your computer and just figure out what was Germany's GDP growth. And I'd like you to just on your way into class, just as you come in, write down the number, because I'm curious to see if you were able to calculate it. All right, next. Diagramming GDP growth. There's one method we can use, what's called a production possibilities curve, or a PPC. Sometimes it's called a PPF, a production possibilities front. And so basically that represents basically everything that we can produce. This line represents if we are producing using all of our resources, we can make either cash crops or we can make staple food. We can make one or the other, but we have to make a choice based on scarcity of what we're going to produce. And so when we use all of our resources, we're producing along this curve. Now, if we're not using all of our resources, then we're not really efficient, and we'll be somewhere inside the curve. And in this case, we're at point X. So at point X, we do have some unemployment. However, if, for example, let's say we move from X to Y, and in doing that, we have, let's say, for example, unemployment goes down, and we increase the amount of goods and services we produce. And if you look, if we go from X to Y, we're definitely producing more cash crops, and we're producing more basic staple food as well. So the amount of goods and services produced has increased. Thus, we have economic growth, or an increase in output, or real GDP. So that's one method to show it. Another method to show it is to expand the whole PPC curve. For example, if we had an increase in population, right, and population got larger in our country, maybe from increased immigration or increased birth rates, that would lead to basically expanded production possibilities curve, because with more workers we can make more goods and services, and so this could lead to economic growth. So again, this is just an example of or examples of how we could show economic growth using a diagram, by either going from a point inside the curve more towards the production frontier, or just expanding the whole curve altogether. Next. If you look here, you can see that we could also do, there's one other method regarding a PPF curve. If you look at any economy, there might be two different types of goods that we could produce on our PPF, or with our PPF curve, looking at our PPF curve. Up here we have consumer goods, and down here we have capital goods. I know it's not labeled appropriately, but just note that y-axis consumer goods, x-axis capital goods. So if we were producing at point B, we're producing more consumer goods. If we were to switch to point A and produce more capital goods are things like robots, tools, machinery, equipment. If we produce more of these things, it might allow us to increase our output, because those are the things needed to make other goods and services. So if we focused more on capital goods, goods that are needed for companies to produce goods and services, that might lead to an expansion of the PPF curve. So by, again, moving from B, consumer goods, to A, capital goods, it might allow us to make more goods and services in general, thus increasing the whole curve. Next, we also have economic growth using AD and AS and LRAS. And the important thing is that all three curves shift, and ultimately that long-run aggregate supply shifts. Initially, we're at this point here. Where we're at macroeconomic equilibrium. If, for example, we have an increase in population, that was the earlier example. If population goes up, the demand for goods and services will probably also rise. Also, with an increase in population, the short-run aggregate supply would also probably increase due to decreased labor costs. When you have more laborers, their labor costs go down. And so, by having an increase in the demand and an increase in aggregate supply, both of them increase, long-run aggregate supply will follow, and we'll have a new level of real GDP. So again, by shifting all three curves, it's going to show an increase in real GDP over time. Okay, so again, those are the three methods. PPC curve, either expanding it or moving it from a point within it closer to the actual production possibilities curve, or changing our focus from capital to consumer, or from consumer to capital goods. Or you can use this diagram. All right, let's talk about, when we think about it, when we conceptualize economic growth, what does this really look like? How does this really work? So if, for example, we invest in capital and machines, if there's increased levels of investment, right? If we went back to this diagram here, if we had increased levels of investment, aggregate demand would shift. However, if this increased levels of investment in technology and machines increased, firms would probably also become more productive. So SRAS would also shift. If both AD and SRAS shift, then potentially long-run aggregate supply would also shift with them, and we would have an increase in real GDP. Another example might be, for example, education and training. If the government spent more on education and training, we might have increased levels of increased levels of education, and the government spending would rise, AD would rise. However, aggregate supply might also increase too, because the cost that companies need to pay in educating workers and training workers might also decrease. So when both of those increase, then potentially would have long run follow. Another way to think of it too is this lower paragraph where it says an improvement in the quality or the quantity of the factors of production, land, labor, capital, or entrepreneurship will result in increased productive capacity, right? So as we said earlier, if we have more investment in machines or tools, if we have an increased supply of labor or better quality labor, this could result in a shift of all three curves and ultimately economic growth. So you need to be able to explain that. Okay, so please remember that. And finally, the last little thing you need to know is economic growth. What are the strengths and weaknesses? Because there are good and bad things about economic growth. They're not all just good. I mean, yes, obviously we have increases in GDP per capita as stated here, right here, and hopefully improvements in living standards as well, which are good things. Again, as the economy expands, generally we also have greater choices for consumers. Consumers have a wider access to a variety of goods and services, which is great. And that usually accompanied with a little bit of economic growth is also a little bit of inflation. And, as we said, inflation a little bit, like 2 to 3%, is generally a good thing because it helps to encourage people to consume. However, there are bad things. As economies expand, we have externalities, negative ones. I mean, if you look at China, China's economic growth has been huge in the last 20 years. But with that has come horrible pollution. I mean, I was in Beijing not that long ago, and I mean the smog, the air quality was pretty bad, and a lot of it was from increased production of goods and services. All these factories that are polluting. Also, with huge increases in growth, often if the growth is fairly rapid, kind of like it is in China or in a few other places around the world, like India or Brazil, we see income inequality also getting worse as well. Basically the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. This is not desirable. We want to have sort of a middle class, or auf Deutsch Mittelstufe, and that is also a desire, a macroeconomic desire, or should be of most countries. Also with economic growth, there sometimes are threats to sustainability or even questions to how sustainable it is, and it kind of relates to the impacts on the environment. But when you look at places like, Brazil, it's increasing its, production on the one hand, but on the other, it's also clearing a lot of forest, and eventually they only have so much forest to clear. Amazon is a really big jungle, but eventually they could expend that resource. So again, economic growth is good, but you need to think about the future and the future's ability to grow as well. And if you are just increasing your growth through an unsustainable method, that really needs to be something that the governments are thinking critically about now. Also, as economies expand, we have increased structural unemployment because as an economy improves and gets better, the needs of the economy change. For example, China. We said China's been growing a lot. Right now they're producing a lot of goods and services. They're manufacturing a lot more than they were in the past. They might also be at the same time becoming more productive with regard to farming methods. They're using tractors, they're using more mechanized modern equipment. And as that happens, the need for farmers and laborers is sort of changing structurally. Some farmers might be unemployed. Maybe their skills, their hard back-breaking labor or work is just not needed. So they might be structurally unemployed because of the shift in economic growth. Finally, the current account. The current account refers to And we'll talk more about it later when we get to macro or international economics, but the current account refers to import expenditure, so how much we're spending on imports, and export revenue, how much money we're getting in exports, or receiving from the sale of exports. And in a lot of countries, as there is economic growth and increases in GDP per capita, consumers purchase more imports, and imports become attractive. And this is not good for the current account, because as we purchase more imports, more goods from abroad, then this hurts our current account, meaning that we have the greater expenditure on imports and as compared to our export revenue. And what that kind of ultimately results in is a net outflow of money from our country. Money is flowing out to purchase imports, whereas it is more desirable to have money flowing in, or a net inflow of money from the sale of exports. But again, this is something that we would like. We would like to have more export sales than expenditure on imports, but as countries grow, they generally tend to spend more on imports, which can be bad. All right, so why don't you go ahead and just to review, can you define GDP? What is the not GDP? Can you define economic growth? So define economic growth, HL. How do we calculate it? Ask yourself for a moment, do I know those things? Then, what are the 3 diagrams, or 4 technically, that you could use to show economic growth? Could you draw them right now? Just practice and go ahead and take a moment and see if you can't draw those 4 different diagrams, or 4 different methods using diagrams that show economic growth. And when you're done with that, go ahead and take some notes on these strengths and weaknesses of growth, and make sure you bring them to class, because we're going to be discussing them and looking at them in a little bit more depth. All right, thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to our next lesson. Enjoy, and we'll see you soon. Okay, bye.